The project's name is Enabling Climate Justice in Coastal Cities through Transforming Communities and Institutions in the MMR. First, we'll look at the way this presentation is formulated. We'll understand why coastal cities and climate justice as an intersection is important to understand. Then we'll go towards our area of concern, that is MMR, Mumbai Metropolitan Region. Third, I will share some methods and methodology that we have followed to understand this project. Fourth will be spatial analysis, which is a large chunk of this presentation. Actually, I have presented this earlier, and I think KTG and Kia have already seen this presentation. I've just added a few slides towards the end, which explain some of our work that we have been doing since past 3 or 4 months after the presentation at Miserior. Yeah. Fifth is the vulnerability hotspots. That is actually concluding part of the part 1 of this work that we have been doing. And last, I will again, for conclusion, I'll go back to the project framework and see how it has come along throughout this journey so far. Okay. So moving on to climate justice and coastal cities. As we know, Indian urban context interjects with certain class, caste, gender, and several other layers. And urban poor and climate change are one important facet which I think needs to be dissected, because climate change does affect all of us. But I think the most vulnerable population that we all know is the urban poor. And current climate change practice, as we have all seen, is just coping, which is short-term or temporary. I could actually call it a band-aid method of dealing with climate change, where we're just trying to band-aid things and try to stop it. But I think the project that we're looking at, and the project that UI is looking at, is actually bringing transformations. And by transformation, we try to understand them as long-term transformations. And there is one more bracket down below, which says small islands of transformation from the focal point of justice. So the second point of this slide is operationalizing the justice principle. I think Roshni or Marina would greatly, expand this realm, but to talk about it briefly, all the rights-based work, or all the work that we have been doing on housing, livelihood, etc., are focused on justice. But I think climate change has a certain narrative which is largely guided either by scientists or the middle class. I think that's why operationalizing justice principle is important when we talk about climate change and urban poor, is because there has been a clear, imbalance between what the scientists say and how it is operationalized. So going to the MMR section, we are looking at MMR for this project, which starts from Vasai Virar in the north and it ends at Alibag. So the mapping process that we did incorporated all of these locations. But when we move towards site selection, or actually working for adaptation in certain sites, we will see that we have tried to kind of diversify and get multiple locations from MMR. Okay, so the climate change impacts. By 2050, urbanization could push up average Mumbai metropolitan region temperature by 2.4 degrees Celsius. So we all know that there are these big climate impacts that will happen on Mumbai, in fact, in all coastal cities, because coastal cities are not only impacted by heat, but there are several other layers that come along with coastal cities. For instance, sea level rise is a very peculiar coastal city phenomenon, or flooding is a very peculiar coastal city phenomenon, or humidity intensified by heat waves or increased sea surface temperatures. So I think these are very peculiar but important aspects which render coastal cities more vulnerable than other locations or other geographies. So as compared to other districts in Maharashtra, Mumbai residents will experience maximum discomfort in 2030s because of the felt temperatures and will experience maximum warm nights. This is from Terry report. So methods and methodologies. I think this is quite an important slide because this is how we went through to understand this project. So earlier the idea was to select areas where Yuva has already worked in, but we felt that we can take a step back and actually understand which hotspots in Mumbai experience more intensified climate change impacts. So that's why we moved on to methods of mapping. I think because mapping covers large, vast geographies, and it also gives us an understanding of the hotspots, like where are they spatially located? What is the context in which they are located? For example, are they wetlands? Are they forests? Are they near coastal ecosystems? Are they mountains? So I think that's why we chose mapping as a method. So first theme is understanding hazard sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure from two themes, which is ecosystem and social. So these hazard sensitivity, adaptive capacity, exposure might sound very vague terms unless we actually contextualize them. So I'll try to contextualize them towards the end of the presentation. So that we actually get a sense of what does exposure mean. Okay, and then the sub-theme that is land, water, air. Under land, we have covered two other sections, that is landslides and LS3. Underwater, we have covered what floods, sea level rise, and flooding due to tidal action. And under air, we have covered air quality index. The social aspects include demographic and economic data of that region. So going back to these three themes that we explored earlier, which is land, water, and air, we have just listed down the areas or the locations from where we got the data from, and the end result, that is the overlapped map, gives us an idea of where the hotspots are. So the first layer for overlap is informal settlements. Second is urban villages or gautans, and third is urbanized layer. So to actually make you understand what we mean by saying overlap, so the first layer that we thought, I think, which is very critical for what the work we are doing, is focusing on urban poor. And that's why we took a rigorous task of mapping or informal bastis starting from Asevera to Alibag. This map might seem like a very tiny map, but it is actually a very detailed map that Mahendra actually took a lot of effort in developing this map, and he marked exact boundaries of the bastis, which actually gave us an idea where are the bastis located. Okay, so once we get an idea of where they are located, I think overlapping these bastis with flood or overlapping the basti with land surface temperature or air quality then makes sense to understand which is the hotspot. I think that is the reason that we mapped this layer. Second, okay, so there is this another map that we had prepared, which is overlapping informal, the bastis and the upcoming infrastructure projects in Vasai Virar. So where are these projects going through, and how much of project affected households and project affected populations will be actually affected by these projects.
Dulari can ask a question while Dulari. Hello. Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Sure, please do.
no, that is, I think, this two maps that you showed, and you saying that Mahindra and you all work. Uh, my question is, do you yourself in-house need to make this map, or is it possible that this map system, be that municipal corporation, department in charge of this, they would have made this map? Because that is my position, in the sense that I believe climate change is such an important subject. The government department is supposed to work. There are large budgets. And these are the most preliminary things, in my understanding, is just that they must have worked on it and produced this report, this maps. So my question is, did you try and find out whether they have done it, or did you think that it's very important for you to make these maps?
Yeah, to answer that, Mahendra, do you want to answer?
I think actually we should like this data is so important that the official government should produce, or should we should be able to get it from there. But
Yes.
when we have mapped it, we have seen a huge gap in the government authorized documents which they identify as informal settlements or slums, and the actual existing slums. So there is a huge gap in the data that we get from the documents and in actual reality. So we had to we had to fill those gaps and to understand actual reality. That is one thing. So there is a and other than that, there are certain secondary like these documents which have mapped these informal. But again, those are certain like they are like 2009, 2010. So in these 10 years, again there are some new informal settlements that have come out. So we had to consider those also and update these layers.
Can I just come in here,
Yeah.
Kirti? So there are two things. Okay? So at the regional level, the MMRD, when they were making the regional plan, have mapped the slums in the MMR. But like what Mahendra is saying, a lot of it is not, is dated. It's the regional plan was made quite a few years ago. And maybe some of it is also inaccurate. And then the thing with municipal corporations, while they may have mapped it and they have this data internally, it is not publicly available. So one part of this exercise is also that we're trying to do is to see how do we make, now that they spend so much of time making these maps, and also it's all done on open source, how do we then make it publicly available so that others can use it? That's also another, sort of a breakaway from this work that has been done over the last couple of months.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Mahendra, they have a disaster response and a disaster plan. Have we checked with them whether they have any maps, whether they have done any studies? Did we ever try and see whether that kind of data is available? Were they open to share it with us, with you?
Disaster response cell. So I think we didn't come in contact with that particular department. So I think we were not in touch with like during this for this mapping exercise.
No, I completely understand that the lens that you have given will be very important, extremely important. But I just wanted to know whether government departments are doing this, whether they have it.
Just small little kind of point. I think this was something very important for me to ask you. I'll tell you why. My position and my understanding of this issue is this: that climate change is such an incredibly big and complex phenomenon, and for a city to, for a region to deal with it, it requires huge amount of resources. And first important step in doing this is mapping the possible impact. And this is on water, this is on wastewater, this is on sewage, this is on vegetation. It's limitless. and what my understanding has been this, that if we as a small organization get involved into preparing this map, we'll get lost. And there are two. So first is to really find out whether this particular exercise has been done by Department A or B or IIT or a consultant, whoever. And then and I think this whole gap idea you talk about is something very important, because that comes from the bias. But my first question is this, Dulari, that is this something that, and this is something for us to learn. And this is something that I've been resistant within in half. That's saying that we shouldn't get involved into doing this. Like, say, for instance, your colleagues are telling us that, we probably, I think, should have GIS person, and we should really identify which are the areas which will get submerged or will get inundated. I said, how can we do it for a city as big as Chennai? It's a huge task. And where can we have resources? And I said, this must happen through system. This should happen to government. This should happen to department. And we've got to find them. And if we don't, we've got to kind of, ask questions of the system why these maps are not available. So, but I think, and so I'm seeking answers on two, which you probably gave. But you consider it's necessary to do these maps in-house, because even the map preparation requires quite a skill. Did you have them in-house? And did you really make enough effort? As a matter of fact, at random, you could say there'll be always gaps in what Sarkar prepares and what NGO prepare, especially on our areas where poverty and marginal groups are concerned. But do you still think it's very important that we do this exercise in-house and do not depend on the systems data and systems data preparation?
To answer that question, I feel it's about the intent of mapping it. So if we look at these boundaries that we have prepared, these boundaries are contested. We can't say that the basti stops here, or we might have missed a few bastis, definitely. But I think the intent of doing this mapping exercise was actually just locating the bastis and seeing how are they overlapping and what are these hotspots. So for example, if we have this basti here, and this is Vasai Virar that I'm showing on screen, and we overlap flooding layer, surface temperature layer, and air quality layer, and it shows that this basti near Nala Sopara is highly vulnerable to climate change. I think that was the intent of mapping these bastis. If it was done for housing, I think there would have been there would require a very detailed understanding of mapping, and then even a single line can create a lot of conflict and contestation. So that is why, since the intent was just to locate the hotspots, that's why we did this. And again, there were definitely gaps, and in fact there are also gaps in the documents that for example VVMC has prepared. So the data which VVMC, Vasai Virar Municipal Corporation, has for informal settlements is in 2014. And there is no recent documentation of that. And if you overlap the development plan, which has marked the bastis, and if you overlap it with 2020-22, the basti has expanded exponentially over these years. So I think definitely if you go towards that methodology of procuring data from government, I feel there is one gap that you will not have the latest data. That is one problem. And bastis expand exponentially in a span of 10 years or 5 years. So that's that. But it actually depends on the intent. Maybe anyone wants to add from the team?
Well, I think let's move ahead. Some of this will also get answered in your later slides, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, please continue. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I think
it's an important thing, maybe for my own positioning, I think, because I am resisting this very much. Yeah. And I've got to rethink how.
The second layer after bastis that we mapped was urban villages or gautans. As if anyone had a chance from this team had chance to see actually the conditions of gautans, they are quite similar to bastis in Mumbai. They are congested, living in unlivable conditions where air or light is not entering houses because they are so closely packed. So we thought that it is very important to map the Gautans because over the process of urbanizations, these are some pockets in the cities which have been ignored by the system, we can say. So, like, if we can state it like that. But yeah, so we thought urban villages was one important, Gaukaris were one important group that were marginalized over the period. And we thought that they also we know that they also experience climate impacts at a remarkable, uh, intense, at very intense. Okay. Then the next layer was urbanized layers. So this layer we thought we should map because first of all, climate change is not the responsibility of the Gautans or the Bastis. So it was really important to understand what localities or what, where are these located? Where are these Bastis located and at what space are they overlapping with the city, or so as to say the middle class housing or high class housing in the city. So I think through this project that Yuva is also trying to have these conversations between the city and the marginalized population in the city. So that is why we thought it was important to map this third layer. So in the next section, spatial analysis, we'll see how these layers are overlapped with these three basic layers. So the first climate hazard that we looked at is air quality index. Instead of actually going and understanding what air quality index is and how it impacts the city, I will directly jump to our mapping process, which is the data that we procured from CPCB and MPCB. And this was the data in November 2021, which shows the region, the name of the station, the location of these stations, and the air quality index in that location in November 2021. This data is also during Diwali time, so it actually shows levels of pollutions during that time. But after this process, we also feel that air quality mapping specifically is not a 1 day or a 1 month, mapping process. It has to be at least annually so that we actually understand which are these hotspots. But since this was just basic level of mapping, we thought doing it for the areas or the data which we have, or work with the data which we have, we try to map the air quality index. So in this process, we also tried to understand the hazard through secondary research, and we tried to contextualize it, particularly in the case of MMR. So throughout this presentation, I will be sharing some cases of hazards. So the first one is case of Mumbai, where the major pollutants are industries, landfill waste burning, power plant, coastal combustion, smelting, biomass burning, vehicular exhaust and unpaved roads, and oil refineries. In case of Vasai Virar, there are these point sources where 33% of air pollution is from industrial sector. And I wish we had a map here, but all the bastis that are there in Vasai Virar largely lie around these industries, and they are actually the workers of the industrial sector. So they are highly susceptible to several airborne diseases, especially the smelting industries that run here, and through our visits, we have known that people are actually getting cancer, lung cancers, by living in these very hazardous locations. The second reason for air pollution in Vasai Virar is multiple quarry sites in Wadev and Vasai East. The third case is of Navi Mumbai. That is, areas like Panvel, Taloja, and Mahape have very, very high industrial areas. There is a big JSW industrial set up right next to the river, which is very close to Alibag actually. Then last case is Thane. Again, there are large industrial belts. So I think more of these air pollution cases are from the peripheries of the city. One big location that we see in Mumbai is Masgaon because of ship breaking. But other than that, most of the industrial pollution is either on dumping sites or due to industries. Okay, and the existing conditions shows that Mumbai is ranked 4th. We thought that we should add these points, 3 important points. There are less monitoring stations. When we were mapping, we also felt that there is a lack of data, especially towards the peripheries. I think we did not get any data from Alibag or Khalapur or Khopoli or Vasai Virar. There is only one station in Vasai Virar. So we had to see actually where can we get the data from. The second is lack of effective community participation in the decision-making processes, and no effective impacts of studies. There is no studies that are found on mitigating the deteriorating air quality throughout the region. I've spoken about impacts, so I'll move on to landslides if anyone doesn't have any question. Landslides, we have actually started working on landslide very closely since I think the past 1 month. But for this mapping process, there is a NASA global catalog which has done the mapping of entire globe, where you can actually get the data for multiple locations. But again, this does not cover all locations. So the orange dots that you see are from the secondary sources that we've got. And these are the locations that we have added over the NASA global catalog data. So in that global catalog data, they have categorized the data in terms of date, the location description, the reason for landslide, the triggering event, the size of landslide, the setting, fatalities, and several other attributes in this table, which gives a lot of detailed information of global landslides. This is another maps from the same website, NASA Global Catalog, and it shows areas susceptible to landslides, and this is only because of the soil conditions. So there we found a gap within the existing data, and actually what is happening on ground is that the data that is available globally particularly focuses on either contours, topography, or soil conditions, but it does not consider the actual conditions of housing or the location of housing that are living in these susceptible areas. For example, you can see Thane written over here, and there is a yellow patch that is marked here. But actually, right along this yellow patch, there are all bastis from Bhandup, Asalpa to Vikhroli, and then Sanjay Gandhi National Park, which does not come under this susceptible map, because it does not consider housing as an important layer while collecting data. So that's what I thought I should point out here. The last point that we have added here is 22,483 bastis were identified as prone to landslides, out of which 3,968 and 18,000 bastis in South Bombay and suburban districts respectively. And there are around 327 locations across MMR, which are actually 327 bastis in MMR. And 9,000 of them needs to be urgently located, 9,000 households.
Dulari, is that your finding? Is that the finding?
No. This is not the finding. So this is from actually a report called by GSI, Geological Survey of India, I suppose. And they have done a mapping of highly susceptible landslide zones or locations in Mumbai. Yeah.
And what is the year, Dulari? What's the year? Which year?
They started the study in 2017, and they released the document in 2020.
Okay. Thank you.
And also Mumbai is known, has been, there have been coming headlines of landslides in Mumbai, especially in July. You can see in 2021, there were 29 landslides in Mumbai. So climate hazards clearly intersect and overlap with a lot of things. And one of the most important layer that we thought was important to be mapped was landslides. Then cases of landslides in MMR. Maybe Marina or Mansi, you want to add on this?
I think we can maybe skip this. These are just cases of landslides. I'm just thinking in the interest of what INHAP is interested in. Maybe we can move ahead.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I have question, Marina. When you have looked at these cases, let's take the Malin case, which was very closer to Pune, and we know, that the government wanted to do this, that they had a whole team over there. Have we followed up on all of this? Is there not this information, but what did the government do? How did they tackle it? Do you have it in record? How these cases were handled?
The Malin case?
No, there was one landslide case which became very, very, which made headlines, the Malin landslide case. Now that we know what the government was doing. In this case, do we know, as a part of your case study, do you know afterwards, what did the government do? How was it handled? I know this is quite big, the July 1267.
Yeah, we are.
You have that information.
Yeah, so we have that information, and in fact, we are following up in some of these communities regarding their rehabilitation, etc.
Okay.
That's a I would say a sub project of the larger project.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we can talk about it later.
Sure. Okay.
The next layer is flooding, which is very important for Mumbai. Along with flooding due to tidal action and sea level rise. So the impacts due to flooding are categorized into three sections. First is built up area, second is low-lying regions, and third is tidal action. Built up area means actually changing the natural systems or deforesting areas, or cutting wetlands and developing new or re-engineering land, and that is why there happens flooding. Second is low-lying regions. There are bastis that actually live in low-lying regions, or most of them live on reclaimed lands. That's why they are prone to flooding. And third is flooding due to tidal action. So the bastis that lie on or live on high tide areas are prone to flooding. So these are the three types. This is a map which was actually prepared by Bhuvan. I'm getting disturbance.
Kirtiji, can you mute your speaker, please?
Ankisha, mute him, please. Who are the host? Ankisha, please mute him. Yeah.
Okay. So this map we have procured from Bhuvan, which is Indian ISRO website, from where ISRO has mapped areas vulnerable to flooding in Mumbai in 2019. And these are the list of areas that are actually coming under in terms of flooding overlapping with bastis. So these are the areas where flooding is overlapping with bastis in Mumbai. And again, there is a map by CZMP, Coastal Zone Management Plan, which shows high tide lines. So what we did was overlap bastis with high tide lines and see which of them come or go beyond high tide lines. So these were the locations that we got for bastis and urban areas. And then the third layer was sea level rise. This map is by Climate Central. Surging Seas is the name of the map, and they have mapped globally. They have mapped the sea level rise up till 2050 and what areas will be submerged due to sea level rise. And these are the locations that overlap due to sea level rise and Gautans and bastis. Okay, so cases maybe, then I will skip these because these are again very peculiar cases, but towards the end, I'll be speaking about some of the cases that we have, some of the locations that we have been to. Next is, this one is an interesting map where we try to overlap the earlier or an historical map with the existing flooding patterns. So we can see that in Vasai Virar, this is the map of Vasai Virar, and this region lies towards the north of Mumbai. And you can see that earlier this area, which is in blue, was a part of the sea. For instance, these were low-lying areas where actually boats used to travel from. But over time, this is the blue. It is the blue area which was reclaimed over time, and now you can see that this entire area is developed into buildings. And if we overlap it with current patterns of flooding, you can see that flooding usually happens where there were low-lying areas. So I think what we're trying to do here is overlapping historical maps and seeing what are the patterns in flooding, or even in land use change and heat, high surface temperature, etc. And the third layer was water, the cases due to tidal action, and where there are bastis that live on high tide lines. So this was one overlap that we did. The next,
Dulari, one question. Due to tidal action, when you interacted with the communities, has there been any change in their fish catch, the marine catch that they used to have from the creeks or the sea? Did you get into that space, or this was not included in your work?
It was included. I will cover it in the ending slides, where we have formulated a form of a framework through which we actually made questionnaires and asked people based on that.
Okay.
The next was land surface temperature. Again, this map we actually prepared on QGIS. It was prepared based on the reflectance of materials. So it is very technical, but what I will try to make you all understand here is, for example, a cement block versus a vegetative grassland reflects heat or light in a very different way. So what this map does is identify what areas reflect the material highly. And I think someone from your team was there who could actually speak about this in detail, Bule. But yeah, this is on the basis of reflective properties of that material. And on basis of that, we identified several locations which overlap with Gautans, bastis, and urban city. And these are the vulnerable areas due to high heat. Here, we're just talking about how there is lack of open spaces or there is heat island effect because of concretization. So I will not get into that. And then identifying climate vulnerable hotspots in MMR. So this is actually the process where we started understanding which areas we need to work in. And to identify that, there were, I think, 3 or 4 steps that we took before actually finalizing on locations. The first one was categorizing the hotspots into typologies. So there are 3 types that we identified. The first one is bastis, Gautans, and urban city overlapping together. So if bastis, Gautans, and urbanization, the urban area right next to the bastis and Gautans experience flooding, so they are high intensified locations. Second is bastis overlapping with Gautans. So this is type 2, and type 3 is bastis with the urban areas. To explain this, I'll just move on to, I'll come back to this. But for instance, this is one area in Bhayandar, and this region experiences poor air quality index. It also has high land surface temperature. It also is susceptible to landslides. It also is susceptible to flooding. So this location in Bhayandar becomes a hotspot where multiple climate hazards overlap together with bastis, Gautans, and city. So I think that was the idea. And to develop this, what we did was actually point out locations where all of this overlaps. So there is the list of locations, and then areas which are susceptible due to, like, these are landslide hotspots in MMR, and then locations. These are flooding hotspots in MMR, and then locations. These are the flooding due to tidal action areas, hotspots in MMR, and then exact locations. So what we tried to do here is actually contextualize the climate hazard. If there is flooding, it is happening over an expanse, but which exact location are we supposed to go and visit and speak to people? So I think that is the importance of this step. If there is sea level rise, which are those locations where sea level rise overlaps with bastis, Gautans, and city? If there is high land surface temperature, where are these overlapping? So that was the intent of actually doing this entire mapping exercise. And through this hotspot method that I just explained to you, we identified areas that are highly susceptible to climate hazards. So there are these parameters, which is LST, landslides, air quality, tidal action, sea level rise, floods. And on the x-axis, we have locations. So Bhayandar has floods, it has sea level rise, it also experiences tidal action, it experiences poor air quality and high land surface temperature. And likewise, we graded the locations based on the intensity of the climate hazard. So coming to the framework and actually revisiting the first slide that I explained, where we tried to map these 4 layers. And the intent of mapping these 4 layers was understanding vulnerability and hazard. So the vulnerability of population living there and the climate hazard that overlaps with, and that the climate hazard that triggers this vulnerability. And through this intersection, we get a risk map, which shows what climate hazard overlaps with what vulnerabilities and where exactly are they located. The second part of this risk map is actually estimating damage. So climate hazard comes in package with loss and damage, and this damage is experienced not only during floods, but in all seasons. For example, if there is high surface temperature, there is people in bastis use exhaust fans in their homes. So that is actually a way that they are actually inducing a lot of economic, their money in electricity. So loss and damage is again calculated in three aspects: economic, health, and livelihood. We haven't started loss and damage estimate yet. We have just I think we have covered this portion of the mapping, but loss and damage estimation, we have to actually develop the tool and implement it on ground. And then the combination of risk map and loss and damage estimation and multiple other factors gives us a way forward to adaptation, which can be preventive, protective, or to prepare the bastis for climate hazards. They can also be nature-based, and they are multiscalar in nature. So the next part is rapid assessment, where so I showed you a list of the locations that we derived from the mapping process. This rapid assessment was to actually go and visit these hotspots and see what actually people are experiencing. So for instance, if this matrix shows that Bhayandar is most vulnerable because multiple climate hazards are overlapping here, but is it really, or is in fact Virar or Thane more vulnerable than Bhayandar? So I think this rapid assessment exercise was to understand the intensity of vulnerability and also to understand what is the people's perception of vulnerability. Here I'll be sharing some of the images from our visits. So this image is from Kranti Nagar, which is actually located on the edge of Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And this basti, if you can see, this is during April 2022, and they have covered their houses in black tarpaulin sheets. So imagine living indoors in these houses. So the adaptation practices that the community is trying to actually adapt to climate change or adapt to flooding or monsoons is actually intensifying their vulnerability in other seasons, and through our visits we got to know that people are unable to live inside because it's so suffocating to live inside, but outside conditions are also not favorable. Another important thing I want to point out here is that this basti lies on forest land, which is along the Sanjay Gandhi National Park, as I mentioned earlier. So they are not allowed to do any form of interventions. So even if you see on the ground, there is just one stream of wastewater that is flowing through the streets, and they are not allowed to build any form of drainage systems or sewerage systems, which actually renders them vulnerable, intensifies their vulnerability during monsoons, because water just flows from everywhere, and along with water there is also garbage and rubble that flows through the streets, which there were also landslide events that happened in this location in 2020. Second was this is Sayadri Nagar in Chembur. This is again a landslide susceptible region. Third is this basti in Diba, which is located, so towards right you can see houses, and this basti is located right on the edge of a dumping ground, and this dumping ground is located on a creek, Desai Creek. So there is an overlap of ecology with climate hazards, with improper planning practices or bastis. So there are several overlaps in this location. Third is, this is Uttan Gauthan or Korivada, which I think, yeah, Neeta ji had asked earlier that do fisher folk, or was there a difference between catch, which was experienced earlier? So yes, fisher folk were very aggressive when they were speaking about their livelihood and the impacts of climate change on their livelihood. They were saying that हमें अभी दूर जाना पड़ता है मच्छी लेने, पास में मच्छी नहीं आता है, खाड़ी में मच्छी नहीं आता है, And yeah, they were also speaking about a very, very, I don't know, a very different incident where earlier वो बोल रहे थे कि हम लोग तारों को देखकर अपनी बोट्स चलाते थे और जाते थे, लेकिन अभी इतना एयर पोल्यूशन हो गया है कि हम लोग को तारे ही नहीं दिखते हैं. Now we have to rely on GPS systems to track ourselves down. And COVID has impacted this Kolivada or any Kolivadas in Mumbai very harshly because they've not been able to practice their livelihood and not been able to sell their produces. And this is another Gauthan in Ulve, which is towards Panvel, towards south of MMR. And this is a crack that has been developed in the house because of big quarry sites that are right next to this Gauthan. And not only cracks or structural cracks in their houses, but they also have been experiencing intensified lung diseases or, intensifying coughing since past 4 years. And these houses also get flooded since past 4 years because a lot of land has been reclaimed right next to this Gauthan to develop the Navi Mumbai airport. So there is this conflict. So the intent of showing these pictures was that we tried and visit multiple type of ecologies. One was Gauthan, one was Kolivada, another was a creek next to a basti, or one was in forest land. So to also understand and to understand the context of these locations and what actually the climate hazard mean to people living in the bastis or Gauthans. So the next step of rapid assessment was to understand the locations through these parameters. First is existing vulnerabilities. That is the vulnerabilities that people already experience. For example, there is lack of water, or lack of electricity, or lack of any form of infrastructure. Second is biodiversity or ecology. The factors that are important in biodiversity and ecology, how were they historically and how are they existing? For example, one factor could be a small talao in the basti. So how was it historically and does it exist today? If it does not exist, what were the earlier relationship of the talao with the people? Or for example, another factor could be wetlands or intertidal areas. Historically, Machimar community used to go in these intertidal areas and actually perform creek fishing. But in the existing conditions, this land has been reclaimed. Wetlands have been reclaimed. The mangroves have been deforested, and there is urbanization that takes place. So this is one layer that we thought we should identify when we speak to people. Second is third is climate hazards. So actual climate hazards, and what is their occurrence? For example, if there is flooding, how many days per year or how many years have it been happening? Second is exposure to climate risk. What is their exposure to climate risk? For example, do they have pakka houses or do they have kacha houses, or is there a storm water connection? So this is the exposure to climate risk and human interventions triggering the hazard. For example, the last case that I explained, the Navi Mumbai airport has been triggering flooding events or poor air quality or high land surface temperature in Gauthans like Ole and Dungi in the region. Fourth one is climate hazards disturbing other factors. We thought that climate intersects highly with health, and it was evident through our visits that health is one big factor which is directly linked to people and climate change. And second one is livelihood, especially for Gaukar Kori community or Agri community, which is dependent on either fish or agriculture for their sustenance. The fourth point is support that they received during, if there was a climate event, what kind of support that they received during these events. The fifth one was understanding actually what people are doing as coping mechanisms. So prolonged strategies and when hazard strikes. What are the prolonged strategies that people have been following or have been trying to adapt to climate risk? And what do they do when the hazard strikes? And the last one was recommendations from the community. So this is the method through which we visited these 27 locations in MMR and tried to categorize them on basis of these heads. And through this, we understood the intensity of climate change. For example, the white color shows low or a lack of presence. Gray shows medium intensity, black is high intensity, and red is extreme. So through this process, what we did was, towards the left, you can see parameters like climate hazard, existing vulnerability, climate-induced vulnerability. And on the x-axis, there are these locations. So for instance, in Ulbe, there is a Gauteng called Ovle. Ovle experiences high flooding. So in 2020, there was human-height flooding in Ovle. There is also poor air quality because there are quarries right next to this Gauteng. There is high land surface temperature that is experienced. There is no landslides or no cyclones. Under existing vulnerability, you can see there is no issue of water or sanitation, but there is big issue of housing. As I showed in the picture, that there has been structural damage on the housing due to blasting from quarries. There is lack of infrastructure, which is unable to sustain the high floods or high water surge during rains. In climate induced vulnerability, there is a high impact on health and livelihood, and there is been extreme damage to ecology, and planning and development have been intensifying the impact of climate hazards, or the climate hazards are intensifying their vulnerability. So this is how we tried to map all these 27 locations that we visited, and then come down to actual locations where we are planning to work as Yuva. And coming back to the basic framework that we are looking at through this project, the next step is to understand not only climate vulnerabilities, but as I said, also loss and damage during hazards, and then ideation on adaptations with the communities and other groups of people who can guide us on adaptations. And that's it.